Good morning, everyone. I guess by now it's afternoon. My name is Melody Barnes. I'm the Executive Director of the Karsh Institute of Democracy, and I want to welcome you to Bond House and to the first event in our Touchstones of Democracy series for the 2025-2026 academic year. It is wonderful to see you here. I know we've got some old friends as well as new, and we are delighted that you are here. The Touchstones in Democracy series is co-sponsored by our Nau Lab at the Karsh Institute, as well as the College and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. As you know, I like to think of this part of the year as we are kind of in the fall season as the eve of the semi-quincentennial as we head into 2026. And the semi-quincentennial, which will be the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, will serve as our theme for our Touchstones of Democracy series for the coming year. It'll give us a chance to reflect on the history and to think about the connection between our history, among the documents that are part of our founding, and thinking about the challenges that are ours to deal with today. I hope that you all have seen the listing of the programs that will take place both the fall, winter, and spring, and I look forward to seeing you here for those. We're really thrilled to kick things off today with two friends and distinguished scholars and a really, really exciting topic. Today's theme is the law. And to join us in that conversation and to focus on the rule of law and the role that the Constitution can play in addressing political division and strengthening our democracy, we are fortunate to be joined by Yuval Levin. Yuval is a senior fellow and director of social, cultural, and constitutional studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's author most recently of American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. And I will encourage you to buy the book if you have not. I have mine at home, my well-worn copy at home, and Yuval will also be available to sign them. The book argues that the Constitution is, quote, more than it seems. While often viewed as a legal and institutional framework, Yuval writes that it is also a framework for union and solidarity, an idea central to the framers' case for its adoption and relevant to democratic renewal today. His earlier books include The Great Debate, Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine, and the Birth of the Right and the Left, and A Time to Build. In addition to his books, Yuval has written for The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, The National Review, The Atlantic, and other leading publications. He also served on the White House domestic policy staff under President George W. Bush and on Capitol Hill, and he holds a PhD from the University of Chicago. And I will say at the Karsh Institute, we also like to claim Yuval as one of our own. He was one of our inaugural board members when we launched the Karsh Institute in 2021, and really appreciate Yuval, all the opportunities for partnership we've had with you and AEI over the years. Guiding today's conversation is my UVA colleague, Professor Mila Versteeg of the School of Law. Mila is one of the world's leading scholars of comparative constitutional law, public international law, and empirical legal studies. She has published widely in top legal and social science journals, including the Harvard Law Review, Columbia Law Review, and the American Political Science Review, which for those of you in the field know is kind of a trifecta. Her award-winning book, How Constitutional Rights Matter, co-authored with Adam Chilton, has been translated into multiple languages, and most recently, she co-authored the Atlantic essay, American Democracy Still Has a Lot Going for It. We are grateful to Mila for guiding today's conversation, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Mila, and let you begin. Please join me in thanking them.
Wonderful. Well, obviously, it's a real pleasure to be here and to have this conversation. I think you've all seen this book by now. Melody previewed its main thesis, but I thought maybe to start us off, I'm going to ask Yuval to just state the main claim of the book, And then I want to ask a series of questions. First, to what do we mean by constitution? What is our constitution? Then I want to talk about this illusory, nebulous concept of unity. And then from there, maybe I want to ask you, how do we get there? So just as a preview of where I want to get the discussion. So with that, maybe you can start telling us what is the main claim of the book.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be here. It's always wonderful to be at a Karsh event. And I just want to thank Melody for a lot of partnerships and cooperation over many years. Just to be part of her important work and your important work is always a pleasure. This book is a kind of introduction to the Constitution that tries to think about it through the lens of national cohesion and national unity, which is an unusual way to think about the American Constitution. I think it's worth looking at it through that lens for a number of reasons. First of all, because we are living in a divided time, and it's worth our while to think about the nature of political division and political cohesion. But also, and more so, because the idea of unity and the danger of division were very much on the minds of the authors of the American Constitution, to a degree that I think we underappreciate now. The first goal set out in the preamble to the Constitution is to form a more perfect union. And in a variety of ways, the rest of the goals are directed, at least in part, at that aim as well. The first third or so of the Federalist essays were really all about how to sustain the Union and keep it from falling apart. The danger of division, of breakdown, of civil war was very much on the minds of the framers of the Constitution, to a degree that we underestimate now because it took a long time for that civil war to happen. And we don't think of Madison and Hamilton as participating in an argument about the danger of civil war, but they certainly thought of themselves that way. Holding the Union together was an enormous challenge. And the Constitution approaches that challenge in all of its institutions and through all of the work of framing that its authors did. And the book begins by asking, the first chapter of the book is just called What is the Constitution? The last chapter is called What is Unity? And in a way, the book tries to answer each of those questions by way of the other. And along the way, to help people think about the particular institutions, the Congress and the presidency and the courts, federalism and the party system, and the structure and purpose of the Constitution through the lens of national cohesion and unity. Again, both to help us see why it mattered to them and to help us see how it might help us today.
Great, wonderful. So maybe let's zoom in on one of the things you said, like the Constitution is more than a legal document, it is a unity framework, right? So in the book, I teach law students and I teach them about Constitution. So I'm with you or a part of your argument. So you say it's a legal document that constrains the government. It's also something like a policy document that enables policy making, right? That's so far so good. It's an institutional framework that sets up the system of government. But then Yuval puts two other ideas on the table that I think are maybe less commonly accepted, right? It's the idea that it's also a political framework in an Aristotle kind of sense, and then also a unity framework. And then, so I'm going to ask you to maybe elaborate on those last two, right? Like we all think of the Constitution as this legal document. It tells the government what not to do, and it sets up the system of government. But what do you mean when you say it's a political framework and a unity document?
Yeah, great, thank you. So I describe the Constitution in that way as a five-part framework. It is a legal document first, and I think that is what it is first. And the Constitution understands itself to be the supreme law of the land. It describes itself that way, and it is law, enacted and ratified and binding as law. It is also a policymaking framework in a way which I think is important for us to understand today. That is, it's intended to create an effective government, a government that can actually govern. This was not a small challenge at the end of the 18th century. It was the reason the Constitution was necessary. There was not a shortage of law in the early republic, but there was not an effective government. And before we can talk about the ways in which the Constitution limits our government, constrains our government, we have to recognize that it created that government and that it was driven by a sense that a more effective government was necessary. It's an institutional framework in a straightforward sense. It creates a set of institutions, a legislature, an executive, a court, and underneath it, a set of courts. And it's important to recognize that those are different institutional structures. Often when we think about the separation of powers in the American system, we incline to language that suggests that there's just this thing called power, and the Constitution divides it into three to make it a little safer. But that's not quite right. The Constitution channels political power through three very different kinds of institutions: a legislature and an executive and a set of courts, also through a system of federalism. It's important to think of these institutionally in the ways they're structured, and we can certainly talk about that. I think it's important to see that the Constitution is also a political framework. And political, what I mean, when I say political, I mean political in the highest sense. It shapes and structures the common life of a democratic republic. And it gives that common life a certain character, a set of assumptions about what belongs in our system and what doesn't, that are not law. They're not enforceable by judges, but they create the character of our system of government, the expectations of the public, and the sense of almost the personality of our political system. And we encounter that character of the Constitution a lot now. There are a lot of constitutional events we encounter in the 21st century where it's perfectly possible for clever lawyers to persuade willing judges to accept that this is legal. And that may be right. And yet it can still be, in very important ways, counter-constitutional, because it isn't the way in which our system is meant to operate, the way in which we make decisions. Those kinds of political judgments are not enforceable as law, but they are enforceable as politics. That is, it's appropriate for citizens to make judgments in accordance with that political sense of what our Constitution is, that idea of what belongs here and what doesn't. It's unavoidably more nebulous, more vague. It's not translatable into a technical language that can be satisfying to us. We incline to a very legalistic way of thinking about the Constitution. But I think that this political sense, the character and personality that the Constitution gives to our polity, is extremely important and is very much a part of the American character. Our national character is tied up with our Constitution to a very great degree. We understand ourselves through it. You find kids arguing, and one of them will say to each other, well, I have a right to free speech here. This is America. Well, what do they mean by that? What they mean by that is very, very heavily shaped by the political character of the American Constitution. And by the way, the person who's articulated this most clearly among scholars of the Constitution in the past couple of generations is Jim Caesar here at UVA. And I very much recommend to you his work on the political character of the American Constitution. And finally, I would say it is important to recognize the Constitution as a framework for cohesion, for unity. If you think about the word Constitution, what it describes is a whole constituted by parts. And that's not only a description of our government, but also of our society. The Constitution saw it as a core purpose to help to keep our society unified. And here, in emphasizing this element of the nature of the Constitution, I very much lean on the work of James Madison. Madison is the first and foremost voice that you'll find in this book, because Madison is very unusual in the American political tradition. You can find a lot of people, we might say like Thomas Jefferson, who think about politics in terms of social justice and equality. You find a lot of people like Alexander Hamilton who think about politics in terms of social dynamism and energy. You do not find a lot of people like James Madison who think about politics in terms of social cohesion and unity. The problems he was trying to solve were the problems of faction, the problems of division. Madison had come up through local politics in Virginia. His father was a politician, and he was a politician his entire life. Every job he ever had, he didn't even pretend to be a farmer like so many of the others did. Every job he had was elected or appointed his entire life. And he was not a lawyer, unlike many of the other prominent voices in the framing of the Constitution. Madison was, today, we might call him a political scientist. And in a sense, that was his education, and that was how he thought. But it's very important to see that what worried him was the specter of division and social breakdown. And to the extent that the Constitution is Madisonian, I do think we sometimes overemphasize that extent, but it is Madisonian to a very important degree. To that extent, it is really about how to hold a vast, diverse society together. And Madison had a very distinct answer to that question, which I think echoes throughout our constitutional history.
Right, wonderful. I'm going to ask you one last question about the Constitution, and I'll move on to questions about unity. So I want to pick up on something you said. You said there's this kids argue over free speech, right? And in the book, you make this claim even more strongly. The Constitution shapes who we are as American. I can say we now because I recently became a citizen, so now I have to reflect on this question, right? The Constitution shapes us. And so if you look at opinion poll data, if you ask Americans, do you like the Constitution? They all will say they love it. Surprisingly, perhaps, but they do. But then if you ask people, do you know what's in the, if you actually test people, do they know what's in the Constitution? The answer is mostly no. But do they think they know what's in the Constitution? The answer is yes. And what do they think it's in their Constitution? Well, it's like their own vision of what good society requires, right? So, which is another way of saying, like our sort of unity around the Constitution increasingly becomes polarized in and of itself. So that's a question for me, right? The Constitution shapes us, but we're deeply divided. So now we see we use the Constitution as part of these partisan struggles, and so how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a very good way to put the question. I mean, I think that we are fortunate that Americans say they love the Constitution. Right. I think they mean it, but I think we are not so fortunate that they do not know the Constitution very well. We are shaped by it, even in ways that we don't fully know. The Constitution describes the norms of civic life in the American experience in a very important way, because the way that it resolves disputes is fundamentally democratic and Republican. That is, it has some trust in majorities, but not absolute trust. It recognizes that majorities can be oppressive, which not every democratic system sufficiently does. It emphasizes process and procedure, which is generally true of American civic life too. The ways in which we tend to approach problems by creating committees, by starting deliberation, that's not natural. That takes a certain kind of social formation. And I think a lot of that formation is a function of the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence, which is certainly the core charter of our society, doesn't really describe a form of government. It is actively ambivalent about forms of government. It actually says that any form of government that the people deem to serve their safety and happiness is legitimate. The Constitution does not say that. It describes a specific form of government, what we might now call a liberal democratic republic. It was a relatively novel idea that this is how a modern government could work. And it is absolutely essential to the character of the Constitution that this is what it describes. It's not neutral about how we do things. And I think that the centrality of proceduralism in American life, which I think would have to strike any outsider to almost any part of our society, is very much a part of our relationship as a society with our Constitution. So I do wish Americans knew the document better, but we are shaped by it more than we know, and without knowing it as well as we should.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm sure other people want to pick up on the theme of the Constitution later. I now want to move on and talk about unity. So the Constitution is a unity framework. So can you first say a little bit more about what you mean by that? I mean, I really like this phrase where you said it's not about disagreeing less, but disagreeing better. Yeah. But then what does that mean, right? How can Americans disagree better if we're not going to agree with each other, which we obviously aren't going to, right? So can you say more about that?
In one sense, we talk about unity a lot in American political life, and all of our leaders talk about it. The themes of most modern presidential inaugural addresses are unity. But what these politicians generally mean when they say unity is something like, if everyone agreed with me, this country would be great. And I believe that too. If everyone agreed with me, this country would be great, sure. But the American Constitution is based in the premise that that is not going to happen. And I think it's really worth seeing the degree to which it takes that as its starting point. And again, it's Madison above all who insists on this point. And you see it in his contributions to the Federalists too. Madison in Federalist 10 has just a stark little line. It's not even particularly central to the argument of Federalist 10, but he says, as long as the mind of man continues free, as long as the reason of man continues free and he's at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed, period. In other words, as long as this is a free society, we are not all going to agree. And I think anybody who's had any experience with any group of people of any size can testify to the truth of that statement. As long as people are free to have their own opinion, they're not going to have the same opinion. And for Madison, very importantly, this doesn't mean we can't be a unified society, because unity doesn't mean unanimity. And I think if I were to sort of frame Madison's answer to your question, what is unity? Madison suggests that unity doesn't mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. And it's not only the difference between alike and together, but the difference between thinking and acting that's particularly important for him. He's talking about political unity, which means addressing common problems through common action, deciding together on how to answer that fundamental civic question: what shall we do? And a politics that understands itself that way doesn't have to agree about everything, doesn't have to agree about some fundamental things. It isn't asking, what shall we think? It's asking, what shall we do? And if you separate these things, I think you're left with a natural question that's unavoidable, which is basically how? How do we act together when we don't think alike? I think the American Constitution is a set of answers to that question. How do we act together when we don't think alike? The answers look like the legislature, they look like the executive, they look like the courts, but each of those has a different role in relation to how we answer that question. And at the very center of Madison's answer, the Constitution's answer, is Congress. That's good news and bad news, but it is at the center of the answer, because a legislature is a venue for deciding how to act together when we don't think alike. And the means for doing it is bargaining, negotiation, deliberation, deal-making. This is how an inherently diverse society can find ways to address its problems, by selecting people to represent the different factions of that society and then having those people deal with each other, literally deal with each other, make deals with each other. That kind of legislative bargaining is at the absolute center of the political logic of the Constitution. It's centrally Madisonian too. You know, there's a way in which a figure like Alexander Hamilton is just innately executive. Hamilton could never have been a legislator, and he wasn't. James Madison was not a particularly good executive. If you study him through his presidency, you wouldn't be that impressed. James Madison was the absolute best legislator of his generation. And the way in which he operated over and over was by approaching a problem that seemed like it couldn't be solved and finding ways toward a solution by saying, what do you want to achieve? What do you want to achieve? It wasn't always about, this is especially distinct about Madison's legislative strategies. It wasn't always about, let's find a middle, where we want 10 and you want 5, so we're at 7.5. It was about bringing in things that didn't even belong in the debate. And you want the capital to be in the South, and you want the banking system to look like that, so let me give you your banking system and you give me my capital. That's how James Madison thought. He thought in terms of building coalitions. And I think that at the very center of the Constitution's answer to how we can act together when we don't think alike is the capacity for coalition building. The American system, even more than many other democracies, perfectly legitimate democracies around the world, the kinds of parliamentary systems that we find in most of the democratic world, the American system is not a parliamentary system in the sense that it does not empower narrow majorities to govern. It requires them to grow before they can govern. This is a source of constant frustration with our system. It's really, really hard to get anything done. And when you win only narrowly at election time, as has happened now for a generation in every American election, the Constitution frustrates you. It constantly says to you, every modern president has found himself in the Oval Office thinking, why am I talking to these people? I just beat them at election time. But the fact is, they won their seats too, and you can't get anything done without them. Every one of our presidents has had to learn this. Our current president is learning it right now. You can talk a lot, you can make a lot of noise, you can set off all kinds of fireworks, but you can't make law without coalitions. And the American system insists on that in order to facilitate its particular brand of cohesion and unity.
Okay, great. So let me ask you another question. So you convinced me that the framers, and especially Madison, thought of the Constitution in this way and designed it this way. But looking at it today, I imagine some here may think that may all be true, but it's not working very well. Arguably, it's failing, right? So sure, that may have been Madison's vision, but his vision is not exactly coming true today, right? So there's a question of what it was meant to be and what it actually is. So maybe can you talk about this a little bit? The book promises some practical solutions, or the sort of the hopeful part of the title is and could again, right? So can you talk about how the Constitution could come to place?
Could, right? There's a lot riding on could. And I do open the book by admitting that I'm not an optimist. I am hopeful, but not optimistic. And I think the difference is that being hopeful means you can see the resources for doing better, but not that you simply expect that things will be better. If cohesion is a core purpose of the American Constitution, then we are living in an era of constitutional failure, because we are living in a divided time, and we do not seem able to get ourselves out of this divided time. And I entirely agree with the premise of your question. Things are not working in the way they were intended. The question for us now, therefore, is should we work to make them work more like the Constitution intended, or are we learning that the Constitution can't work for 21st century America? I have to tell you, these are both plausible answers to the question. It is not ridiculous to say that our 21st century experience teaches us that an 18th century Constitution cannot support the life of this republic. But I don't think that's true. I don't think it's crazy or stupid, but I do think it is wrong. And the way to approach that question is to ask ourselves, are we witnessing a failure of constitutional design or constitutional practice? Is Madison's logic not true anymore, or is our practice of constitutional politics no longer aligned with his logic? Those are very different answers because they point in very different prescriptive directions. And I think you see versions of both of those answers very much alive now in American politics. I'm very much on the side of the second answer. That is to say, I think the Constitution still has the solution to the problem we face, but that in order to allow that solution to work, we have to embrace the logic of the Constitution in practice, which means we have to look at the constitutional problems we have through the lens of the thinking of the framers. And I would say to you, by the way, that this is more true now, in my view, than it has been in a very long time, because our biggest constitutional controversies for most of American history have actually been controversies not about the questions that most occupied the framers. They were controversies about personal rights. And that's most of what constitutional law has been for most of our history. It's most of what our deepest debates have been. That, of course, remains very important. But we are now in an unusual constitutional moment. We have been for a generation or so, when our biggest constitutional questions are actually structural questions. They're about the structural Constitution. They're about the powers of the president. They're about the powers of the courts. They're about the nature of the Congress. They are about exactly the questions that the framers of the Constitution thought about. And I think looking at Madison and Hamilton and Mason and the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and the Jeffersonians now is more pertinent to our contemporary problems than it has been at any point in my lifetime, and maybe in some ways at any point since the early decades of the 19th century. Because to a very unusual degree, we are arguing about the structure of the Constitution. And the structure of the Constitution is built on this logic of promoting coalition building. And so where I offer proposed solutions in the book, a lot of them are about how to facilitate coalition building. They're focused on Congress. The weakness of the Congress is easily our biggest constitutional problem now. This is hard to see in this moment because we're all focused on these titanic struggles between the president and the courts. Those struggles are happening because Congress has refused to do its job. Congress has created a vacuum for 25 years now that has been filled by presidents and courts the idea that presidents and courts would want more power would not have surprised the framers of the Constitution. The idea that Congress would not want to use its power would have surprised them a lot. And I think that's the problem that demands the most thought and action now. The fact that members of Congress don't think of themselves as lead actors in the drama of American political life. They're just watching the president like the rest of us, is an enormous problem for our system of government. If that can't be fixed, then I do think we may be in a place where the Constitution can't be restored. But I think it can be fixed. And I think we've seen periods in the past where Congress has become a kind of secondary actor and then responded to that by reasserting itself. A lot of my work, my day work, not so much in this book, is just in everyday think tank scholarship, is about that question. How can we change the incentives that confront members of Congress so that they will see it as in their interest to assert themselves? And I do think that ultimately, in order to find a constitutional balance that can help our society be less divided, we have to recur, at least to some degree, to the logic of the framers, to the logic of the American Constitution, and to find our way toward a constitutional order that has Congress at its center, that requires the executive to think about facilitating stability. That's the president's job, believe it or not. Steady administration, as Alexander Hamilton described it. I mean, imagine that now, steady administration. And to think of the courts as existing to police the rules of the game. This hasn't been how we've thought about our Constitution for quite a while. And I think this is a time when we really need to restore our connection with the thinking of its authors.
Wonderful. So I may have time for one question that's sort of related and maybe not, but I feel like it hovers maybe over some of this conversation. So early in the book, you say, I'm a conservative, a hopeful conservative, right? And but I read you to be a Burkean kind of conservative, small c conservative, if you want. You favor slow coalition building over rapid policy change. And then you sort of contrast this progressive vision of wanting quick policy changes, being frustrated with the Constitution because it doesn't get us what we want. And reading that at this moment, that doesn't feel exactly right. I feel like all conservative progressives right now are rooting for a conservative Supreme Court to maybe stop the president in some time. At least some of the time, we're rooting for state rights, right? So there is like so I feel like it's a point in time when we're sort of, it's confusing to think about what it means to be a progressive or a conservative. So I wondered, and I know you've written on this in your prior work, so I thought maybe you can help us think through what it means to be a progressive or a conservative today.
Yeah, so look, to some degree, constitutionalism is a function of where you sit as much as where you stand.
Correct.
And both parties discover federalism in the courts when the president is of the other party. That is a constant. And suddenly you love state power, and 4 years later, suddenly you love the presidency again. That's not new, and it's not one party or the other that does this. But I do think that there is a particular kind of critique of American constitutionalism that has been part of an intellectually serious progressivism from the start. And it's a critique that says that the American system values procedure over outcome and values, its defenders might say, legitimacy over efficiency. It's too damn slow. And it doesn't allow change to happen. It's resistant to change. And in that sense, it's conservative, right? And so it stands in the way of the work of people in our politics who think that there needs to be a lot of both social change and policy change. The most articulate champion of this view was Woodrow Wilson, before he was president, really, as a political scientist. And in a sense, this view is Wilsonian, and I describe it that way in the book. The critique of the Constitution that says that separating powers makes no sense. It doesn't allow elected majorities, which after all are the only legitimate holders of power in a democratic society, to actually act on the mandate they got from voters. And so Wilson argued for centralizing power in the presidency. He argued for centralizing power in Congress, in congressional leaders, rather than decentralizing in committees and members. He argued against federalism and in favor of strong national power. And that critique is still very much with us. And I think it is still worth calling it a Wilsonian critique because he offered that critique not just as a cynical politician, but as a serious scholar of the American Constitution. But that said, looking at our politics now, I would argue that the most Wilsonian president we've had since Woodrow Wilson is Donald Trump. I also think, by the way, the most Wilsonian congressional leader we've ever had was Newt Gingrich. They're both Republicans, and they do operate out of a critique of our system that is rooted in frustration with how slow and difficult it is to advance partisan agendas. I think it makes sense to call that progressive in a kind of historical sense, but Donald Trump is not otherwise a progressive. And it does still matter. I mean, I think the distinction between progressive and conservative, which has been with us roughly since the time of the American founding. It started in Britain at the end of the 18th century. It came to America a little later, but not much later. That distinction, which is a distinction among liberals, it's two ways to be a liberal and think about how societies should change, is still relevant, still matters, still divides left and right. I'd give you a little bit of a rule of thumb for thinking about it by saying that, as a general matter, conservatives tend to think that the biggest social problem is disorder and social breakdown, and they tend to think about politics in terms of order and chaos, civilization and barbarism. Progressives tend to think the biggest social problem is oppression of the weak by the strong. They tend to think about politics in terms of oppressor and oppressed. These are both big social problems in any free society, and so we need them both. But if you listen to our politics now, listen to a debate about immigration. One side is talking about one side is talking about order and disorder, about civilization and barbarism, about invasion. The other side is talking about oppressor and oppressed, about who has the power and who doesn't, what we owe to people without power in our society. Think about policing. It's a debate between people who think they're talking about order and disorder and people who think they're talking about oppression. That basic challenge, the ways in which left and right talk past each other, is still very relevant. Donald Trump is very much on the right, if you think about it that way. Today's progressives are very much on the left, if you think about it that way. But I agree with you that our debates about the Constitution aren't that simple at the moment.
Right. Wonderful. Do I have time for another question, or shall I move to Q&A? Okay, so maybe let me end with a Thomas Jefferson question, because we've heard a lot about Madison, and we're at Thomas Jefferson's university. Yeah. So Jefferson had this vision that each generation should write its own constitution. He actually calculated how long a generation lasts, which in his days at least was 19 years, and he came up with that number. Like every 19 year, a country, or the United States should replace its constitution. One remarkable finding in the comparative literature in which I work is that around the world, the average constitution lasts exactly 19 years. Jefferson was right, just so you. And many state constitutions have these provisions saying every 19 years we're going to ask the electorate whether they want to call a convention and replace their constitution and start over, right? Yeah. So, and there is this sort of common refrain in history, countries frequently replacing their constitution whenever there's a crisis or it doesn't seem to be working very well. States routinely changing their constitution. And there's something about the American Constitution that it has stuck over time. And we're still with this document that is very old and we're not sure does it work today. So, but I guess the question I want to ask you is like, what is it that made it that made it stick, right? You may or may not know the answer to the question.
No, this is a great question, and I would say, let me say first, I love Thomas Jefferson, but I don't love this idea of his at all. And I think there is a way in which the American Constitution benefited tremendously from the fact that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were absent when it was written. They would both have pulled in opposite directions, by the way, in ways that would have made it impossible for the Constitution as we know it to have been framed. Jefferson was in France, and he came up with that idea having spent a lot of time in France, so I just attribute it to that. The best answer to his argument came from James Madison. Jefferson proposes this idea of every 19 years in a letter to Madison in September of 1787. And Madison's response is just an incredible kind of work of diplomatic letter writing. Madison's always really careful about Jefferson when they disagree. And he says, well, it's an interesting idea, but think about what life is like the day after all the laws expire. And suggested to him that change has to happen slowly. Now, I think it's not just Jefferson. The American Constitution is the result of a very peculiar historical moment. I don't think it could have been written at any other moment in our history. The 1780s followed a 10-year period that consisted of 5 years of war and 5 years of peace. The 5 years of war were all about the danger of centralized government. The Americans talked themselves into an argument against the power of the king that was very radical. They meant it. The 5 years of peace were full of evidence about why you need an effective government. They were chaotic. There was a breakdown of government in every one of the states. Total chaos. There were elections every year for every state legislature but one. All the governors except New York were extremely weak. And the framers of the Constitution walked into the convention much more worried about chaos than about tyranny. But they had in their mind, because it wasn't that long ago, and they all fought in the war in one way or another, they had in their mind that worry too. They were looking for a balance between a government that was too strong and too weak. Now, Thomas Jefferson was simply absent from the United States during those 5 years of peace. He did not live through the chaos of the early republic, the earliest early republic. The chaos in Virginia, the chaos in Pennsylvania, the radicalism, the populism, it was all there in a 5-year period of total, absolute chaos. That's why the Constitution was written. It was because of that period. They needed a currency, they needed courts, they needed an executive. They couldn't just be governed by a radically democratic legislature. And Thomas Jefferson was, in 1787, still where he had been in 1783. Almost nobody else in the United States was. And I think his radicalism was in part a function of that. He wasn't very fond of the Constitution when he first saw the draft that Madison sent him. He persuaded himself, and he came to be a defender of it. I think in some ways a truly great defender of it as president in particular. But I do think that not experiencing the America of the immediate post-war years is what set him apart from others. And they were right. It was necessary to do what they did.
Wonderful. Thank you. With that, I think we can turn it over to questions from the audience. Maybe over there.
Thank you.
Maybe you can state your name.
Don
Yeah, please.
Price. Not 19 years, but I look at sort of 80 years.
Yeah.
So we have the founding of the country and the Constitution and the Jefferson Adams and the Hamilton and the Madison. I look at that as kind of what's the formulation of the country going to be? And about 80 years later, we have the Civil War. And I look at that, it's not just North-South, but it's will we have a nation that continues? And roughly about 80 years later, we have the end of World War II, which I think is actually the beginning of the civil rights movement, which is will we have the application of all the laws to all of the citizens? Mm-hmm. And I don't know how to describe 80 years later what we are going through right now, which is more than rural urban, it's more than red blue, it's more than conservative progressives, but it's clearly as divisive, I think, as any of the other periods. And I just would be curious as to your thoughts on that.
Thank you. It's a great framework. There's another way to think about it, which is to look at the sort of clumps of constitutional amendments. Amendments come in packages, and there are long, long stretches between them when everybody's saying, why can't we get together and change the Constitution? For years and years and years, there is immediately after ratification, you have the Bill of Rights and also the 11th and 12th Amendments, which sort of made technical fixes to the Constitution right away. And then there's a long stretch until after the Civil War where nobody touches the Constitution. Then there's a long stretch until the Progressive era when nobody touches the Constitution. Then there's a long stretch until, again, a series of kind of technical amendments in the middle of the 20th century. The term limits for presidents and presidential succession and various things. And we've now seen another long stretch. The last constitutional amendment, in a way, was the 27th in 1992, but that, we can talk about why, but I don't actually think that's a break in the pattern. That was one of Madison's original amendments. It was part of the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. It's almost symbolic. We've gone a very long time now without a constitutional amendment. I think both of these point to a kind of pattern in American history and American civic life of unification and division. What worries me about that pattern is that the periods of unity that make it possible, among other things, to amend the Constitution generally follow in the wake of crisis, a very great crisis. This is always the problem with a kind of communitarian social thought, which is all the good times follow war and depression and terrible things. And so we say, why can't we be the America of the 1950s? Well, we don't want the world of the 1940s. And to the question of how can we get ourselves out of the rut that we're in, the division that we're in this moment, I look for answers that operate within the framework of the Constitution, because I don't think that we want the depth of crisis that would be required for us to have that kind of unity again. The ironic thing about amendments to the Constitution, they're changes, right? But they only come in moments of cohesion. They require massive supermajorities. And so they don't actually follow division and crisis. The Civil War, post-Civil War amendments are kind of an exception to that. They were imposed on the South against its will, but the North was exceedingly, incredibly unified in that period. And in every other case of constitutional amendment, there's very broad agreement before that can happen. We are not in a moment now when we can think about how to address our problems through constitutional amendment, because we don't agree about anything. There's not a 3/4 majority for anything on any issue. It's not possible to get there in this moment. So that, in a sense, and this is also why I think the Wilsonian critique of the Constitution doesn't really make sense right now. That argument says there are majorities and they can't get their way. Our situation right now is actually there are not majorities. There's not something that some big American majority wants to do and the Constitution is standing in its way because it's too slow. What would that be? Our problem is we don't have majorities. And the Constitution is there to help us form majorities by forcing us to form majorities, by saying you can't do anything unless you talk to those people. I think if we took that seriously and allowed ourselves again to take the advice of the Constitution about how to operate in politics, we would have a better chance of forming majorities. And then we could think about whether and how there's any need to change the system.
Yeah. I'm pointing to you. Go ahead. Oh, the microphone is there? Okay.
Hi, Worthy Martin, retired faculty. But the Constitution does provide a more Jeffersonian-like way to change it. What do you think the possibilities of that happening?
Yeah, well, God help us is what I think. I mean, it does. It allows for a convention to be called, and for that convention to have essentially unlimited power to revise the Constitution once it's called. There are a lot of people in our politics who have argued we should do that. Most of them are friends of mine on the right. I think they could not be more wrong. Because that kind of convention would have far too much power to revise our Constitution without consulting majorities, without consulting other institutions, without taking its time and thinking slowly. I just don't think we would end up in a good place. The American Constitution, as I said, I think it came from a very peculiar moment in our politics. I don't think, and the same is true of the Bill of Rights, of what immediately followed the Constitution. I don't think that any generation of Americans, except the generation that presided at the end of the 18th century, would have adopted the First Amendment, for example. The First Amendment would never pass today. If it didn't exist, and you said to people, what about absolute freedom of speech? No way would that pass in the United States. And no other democracy has that. It's not a normal feature of democratic life. For most of American history, religious freedom of the kind guaranteed in the First Amendment would have absolutely no chance of getting majority support. We're very, very fortunate that we have that framework from that strange moment that thought seriously about the need for majority rule and the danger of majority oppression at the same time. I just don't think that our generation would do that. And I don't think we should set ourselves loose on the Constitution. The durability of it, the fact that it has lasted as long as it has, is a great strength that we should take seriously. It's unusual. The American regime is now the oldest in the world. The British can claim they have the oldest, but their institutions have the same names they had in 1800. They're nothing like what they were. The United States has basically the same government that it had in 1800. Everybody else has been conquered 3 times or had 5 revolutions since then. And so we think of ourselves as a young country, but we are actually an old polity. And our strength is in that. Our ability to endure through extreme crisis is something that we should be grateful for. And look, do you look at Congress and think these people ought to get to rewrite the Constitution from scratch? I do not.
We had a question.
Thanks. Hi, I'm David. I'm a 4th-year student here. And I was really curious that you allege that the path to unity is not towards changing the Constitution, but following the logic of it. And it got me thinking, can unity come out of the practice of originalism in the Supreme Court?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the most significant source of unity in American constitutionalism is legislative deliberation. Congress has to be at the center of how we solve our problems. And that can help to facilitate unity because it provides a kind of legitimacy to otherwise controversial decisions, right? We often attribute these kind of successes to our presidents. We talk about the civil rights laws of the 1960s as if Lyndon Johnson made them happen. But the fact is, they happened in Congress. And the fact that they happened in Congress was very frustrating to people who wanted necessary social change in that period. It took 12 years to get to the Civil Rights Act of '64. But it also meant that they got some votes in the South, that where they didn't get votes in the South, the senators and representatives who voted no had participated in the debate. It was clear to their voters that the country had worked this out. And that didn't mean there wasn't resistance, but it did mean there was much less resistance than there would have been, and that ultimately it was legitimate. That made it possible for the courts to enforce those laws. That made it possible for presidents to enforce those laws. The deliberation that led to them was essential. I think that if originalism in the Supreme Court means that the court sees it as its role to enforce the structure of the system, to make sure that the other actors in the system are playing their proper part, which I do think is what originalism means, then it can help to facilitate unity. But that doesn't mean that the court puts itself in place of Congress to resolve big national debates. That means that the court requires the other constitutional actors, the states and Congress and the president, to play their part. It seems to me that that is generally how today's court majority thinks about what it's doing. If you look at its administrative law decisions of the past 15 years, you could summarize all of them as just saying Congress needs to do its job. Congress hasn't taken that advice, but over and over, that's what the court is trying to say. I also think that a lot of its decisions about executive power have basically been about saying the president runs the executive branch, but does not run the rest of the government. That's a kind of shortened version of 25 years of administrative law. I think that's right too, and that this court is trying to do that as well. It can't do it on its own, and we can't just say things won't go wrong when the president tries to be an autocrat because the courts will stop him. I do not think that's possible. Only Congress, by stepping in and asserting its own prerogatives, could possibly bring our system back into balance. And so our focus has to be there.
Yeah, over here. Maybe can we take a couple of questions and then, because there's lots
Yeah.
of...
Hi, I'm Miriam Fleetman, retired U.S. government. You posed the question, how do we change the incentives of members of Congress so they see it in their interest to assert themselves? So I'm wondering, what is your answer to your own question? And particularly, how do we give Republicans the incentive to stand up to Trump's overreach?
Wonderful. Can we maybe just collect a couple of more because there's lots of people, if that's okay with you?
Hi, thank you so much. I guess I just wanted to ask you to put some of this a little bit in conversation with some of your previous work. I mean, I'm thinking about the fractured republic and subsidiarity.
Thank you. You're the person who read that book.
I think so. I work on cities, so I'm interested in local government. So anyway, I think I'm trying to think about these big picture kind of like central constitutional questions and how they relate to what I see as also a different kind of impulse in your sort of tradition of thought towards decentralization, and how does that relate?
Great.
Maybe one more behind there, and then you can respond to it.
Yeah, I want to know what, my name is Don Goldblum, and I'm an alum, and I'm very loyal to the university. I want to know what the effect that the direct election of senators versus the way they were originally appointed and the primary system has affected Congress, and whether that has made it more able to do its work or less able to do its work.
Lots on the table here.
Great.
My
Those are great
apologies.
questions. Well, okay, let me, so first of all, the question of how to change incentives in Congress, which is a big subject of the book, I think at the core of how to think about that is how to incentivize legislative negotiation, which has been disincentivized by now really almost 50 years of centralization of power in Congress by both parties. Both parties have given their party leaders a lot more power than they used to have in Congress. And a lot of what that's meant is that the big policy decisions are made by a very small number of people in Congress. And everybody else, members of Congress are smart, ambitious people, believe it or not. They really are. And the question they're asking themselves is, how can I succeed? And the answer to that right now looks like becoming prominent in the theater of our politics. You succeed by producing YouTube clips. And they're not wrong to think that. They're right, because they don't have much of an opportunity to succeed by bringing home to their constituents various policy benefits or by participating in negotiations over big policy changes. So a lot of what I would point to is a decentralization of power in Congress, allowing the committees to matter again. There's a lot for Congress to learn from the state legislatures on this front. A lot of state legislatures, a majority of them now, 28 of them, allow committees to control floor time, which is a very mundane kind of thing, but would be absolutely transformative in Congress. If even some small portion of floor time were not in the control of the speaker or the majority leader, but of the committees, and if you got a bill through committee, you were going to get a vote on it on the floor, the incentives confronting members would change dramatically because they would be firing with real bullets in their committee work. They would actually be making laws. Right now, the only place where laws are made is in the leader's office at midnight before a government shutdown. And there are not a lot of people in that room. And so giving members more of an ability to actually exercise power would make them more interested in their power. And at the moment, Congress is just bizarrely uninterested in its own power. And so it says, yeah, the way to move the ball is for the president to impound money, take away our most basic fundamental legislative power, the power of the purse, because that's how our party could get what it wants. I think allowing members to be much more invested in legislative work. So that kind of committee change is one way to think about it. I think in general, allowing committee members to have more control over who's the chairman, what's the agenda. These are all perfectly achievable. They're all done in most legislatures around the world and in many around the country. And there's a lot for Congress to learn from that now. I do think it connects with one of the later questions because it also seems to me that another necessary reform or set of reforms would have to do with primary elections. I am not of the view that the direct election of senators is a big part of the character of our political culture now. There's a kind of fashionable attitude that says the 17th Amendment ruined the system and let the state legislatures choose senators. I guess I think it might be marginally better if the state legislatures chose senators. It would also be worse in various ways. There were reasons why that got changed. State legislative elections in the 19th century in America became all about the US Senate in a very weird way. Members, people would run for state legislative offices by saying, I'm going to vote for, Abraham Lincoln for Senate, to take an example. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were about how the state legislature would vote for the Senate. It was a debate in a Senate race, not a presidential race, and the voters in the state were not going to vote in that election. I'm not sure going back to that is a solution to a problem we have, but primaries, which are not new, which were not, which didn't create the problem we have, are a big part of the nature of the problem we now have. They interact very poorly with contemporary American political culture. And I would say generally, in thinking about reform, it's very, very important to remember that that prescription is not diagnosis in reverse. You don't fix a problem by undoing what caused it. It is not possible to undo what caused the problems we're talking about. The question is, how do we move forward in ways that change incentives and address those problems? And so the primaries didn't create our problems, but changing how parties choose candidates would have a lot to do with how we fix these problems. We now start every election cycle by asking the craziest people in America, what do you think? And then the whole system is full of the people they chose, and those are the only options that face other voters. And look, I speak as one of those people. I vote in primaries. I'm crazy too, but I spend a lot of time thinking about politics, and most voters don't. And both parties now pay a huge price for the primary system. Both parties, you can point to elections in the last 15 years where they've lost seats they should have won because they ran people that the average voter just thought was a nut. And the party system exists to avoid that. Its purpose is to win general elections. So both parties are failing now. We're in a 50-50 moment because neither party can put even remotely adequate candidates in front of the public for many national offices and state-level offices. And most voters go in thinking, well, which one of these people is less bad? It doesn't have to be that way. And if the parties thought about their roles more seriously and understood that success meant building a coalition, winning a broad general election majority, they would think pretty differently about how to choose candidates. And I think that it is time for experimentation on that front. Oh, sorry, I missed one question. What was there were three questions. Oh, thank you, subsidiarity. It was from the only reader of my prior book. Thank you for that, by the way. And yeah, so this is a theme of this book too, certainly. I think that one of the great strengths of the American system is its capacity for decentralization. It's part of what drives us crazy about it too, but it uses the immense diversity of this society as a strength. I think it's always important for us to remember that the United States is more massive and diverse than most democracies. Not all democracies, but the US is much more like India than it is like Belgium. And we have to think of our problems in relation to the challenges that face mass democracies. There's a tendency in comparative political science to say, well, they get this right in Sweden, why can't we do that? Well, there's a lot of reasons why we can't do what they do. And the American Constitution is distinctly well constructed for a mass, vast, diverse democracy. And it prioritizes a certain kind of legitimacy over efficiency for that reason. And I do think we have to look for ways to use our diversity as a source of political strength. At the core of that is federalism. And I try to think in the book about federalism through the eyes of the framers of the Constitution. Federalism isn't simply subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is a preference for the local. And I certainly tend to think that way about politics. Federalism just wants to separate the local and the national. What's important about the logic of federalism in the framers' way of talking about it is that there are two parallel governments in the American system. They don't sit over each other. They sit next to each other. The big divisive debate at the convention was, are we creating one national government and the states just become administrative districts like counties? Or are we 13 governments and what the national government is like the United Nations? It's a place for us to solve problems we have in common, but not to govern the people. The convention could not arrive at an answer to that question. And their solution was to do both at the same time. It wasn't logical, as Madison says in Federalist 47, don't try to make sense of this thing, but it's going to work. And I think he was right about that. The solution is both the national government and the state governments govern the people directly, but they govern the people directly in different arenas. And I do think that we've messed this up some, that we have now entangled the state and federal governments in some very important areas, in education, and welfare, and healthcare, in ways that have not been good for governance, and that federalism reform has to involve some disentangling in the coming years. So that if we're going to trust the states with welfare, you have to actually trust the states with welfare. And look, if you're not, then don't. We could nationalize healthcare financing. That wouldn't be a crazy thing to do. But to both nationalize it and decentralize it at the same time, the Medicaid system is not an answer to any question that anybody's asking. It makes no sense. It leaves no one responsible for anything. And as a result, it does a grave disservice to the people that it's meant to serve. So I think it's worth thinking about federalism now in that sense, in terms of how we can disentangle so that the system can perform its proper function.
One more question? Okay, one more question. Over there.
Yes, Betsy Dalton. I was wondering if you could comment on term limits, particularly term limits for the Supreme Court and also within Congress.
Yeah. Well, those are different questions. I would say I'm very much against term limits in Congress. I just think somebody is going to someone is going to be in Washington all the time and therefore have a lot of power. And I would prefer that somebody be an elected official and not a lobbyist or congressional staffer. You build up authority through seniority. There's no way around that. And if you look at Congress today, it is absolutely not the case that the oldest members are the worst members or that the people who've been there the longest are the worst at the job. It is the other way around. And so I don't think that the term limits have ever been the right way to think about how Congress should work. I think it makes sense for Congress to train people in the art of legislation and then to benefit from their experience and their capacity. So I'm not for term limits in Congress. I think there's certainly a plausible argument to make that Supreme Court justices now spend too much time as Supreme Court justices. We game the fact that they have lifetime terms, so if you're 49, you're too old to be appointed, and the expectation is this person's going to be there for 40 years. That's obviously not how the system was meant to work. And I think it creates some problems. The trouble is, anytime you think about political reform, you have to ask yourself, compared to what? There are definitely problems with how long Supreme Court justices serve. The question is, what is an alternative system? And I think there's a reason why the framers wanted lifetime tenure. The reason is so the judges are not subject to political pressure. They don't have to run for office. And so they don't have to think about the next election. And that means, and this was very important, in fact, it's in the work of George Mason especially that you find this argument, that judges appointed by a particular president will be willing to oppose even that president because they don't need him ever again. And I think that's true. That happens now. That happened last week, and it's going to happen again next week. The courts are willing to, the judges are willing to do their job even when it wouldn't make sense if they had to think as politicians. Obviously, they all think politically to some degree. Many of them are predictable in political ways. But I think that ultimately that's a function of how they think about the law and the Constitution, and we're reasonably well served by lifetime tenure. The answer that people have offered are long terms, right? 18-year terms. That's a long time to serve on a court. That's not crazy. And I think there's a lot of logic to that. There's a lot of reason to that. The journal that I run, National Affairs, published an argument for 18-year terms by a law professor at the University of Missouri named Josh Hawley, who is now a senator, and by the way, no longer agrees with himself. I've asked him several times. It's a piece worth reading, and it's an argument for 18-year terms. And I think the problem with it is the kind of problem we had when senators were appointed by state legislatures, which is people would run for president on a slate of Supreme Court justices. Now that's almost already happening. Donald Trump started that by putting out a list. And honestly, I know a lot of people personally who voted for him because of that list. And he kept his promise, and so they voted for him again. I don't think that's great. I don't think it's a good idea for the Supreme Court to become a political football in that way, so that judges become even more identified with the presidents who appointed them. And our presidential elections become essentially elections to the Supreme Court, because every president would get 2 appointments under that system. That said, I'm open to a solution that doesn't have that problem. I do think Supreme Court justices serve too long now, and I can see that as a question in need of an answer.
What about a mandatory retirement age?
Yeah, that makes some sense to me. I think you'd start to see people appointed even younger, but maybe that's okay. You know, again, the question you'd have to ask in that instance is whether the oldest justices are the ones you most want to see gone, and maybe, not always. So I'm not sure it's exactly a solution, but yeah, I think some way of thinking about this as a problem does make sense now.
Wonderful. I think you join me on thanking.
Thank you very much.